Hi, I'm Adam Kadri. Welcome to the third installment of Radio K. If you don't know what this is, check out Radio K number 1 and listen to the introduction. We'll begin this one by wrapping up 2002 with a look at the bronze medalist in that year's interactive fiction competition. It's called Photograph, A Portrait of Reflection by Steve Evans. And Claire Parker is back to talk about it with me. I guess I should start by reiterating that the idea here is to discuss these games rather than to review them. And while that doesn't always mean giving away the ending, in this case it does. So, here is your spoiler warning. Alright, that's enough of that. So, the premise of this game is that you're playing this 55-year-old hermit living in a cabin in the Australian bush. And he's happened across this photograph, hence the title, showing himself with his girlfriend of 30 years earlier. And he's convinced himself, pretty much arbitrarily, that this photo shows the exact moment when his life took the turn for the worse that resulted in him living here by himself. And I think the game makes a point of saying that it's arbitrary.
It's very explicit that it's a completely arbitrary moment that he decides, and that was kind of part of my problem with it. Is it was so arbitrary that I wasn't even convinced that he was convinced. I get that it's sort of an unreliable narrator situation, like maybe Melanie, the girl he's pining after, wasn't really right for him after all, but I didn't see like why he even thought that she would have been. Like, why was he so convinced about this moment? What was his like vision of the future? Maybe you're supposed to fill in the blanks, and I just was not able to do that. That bothered me. I didn't see anything in Melanie. I didn't like her. I didn't see why he liked her either. I didn't see like him looking back and being like, oh, she was so amazing. Like, she would have done such amazing things for me. It was pretty much like he looks back at her and she seems pretty whiny. I don't see any like longing or love coming from him. It's just sort of like, well, she was this girl and she was pretty. And maybe if I had stuck with her, then she would have stayed with me forever. But I just wasn't really convinced.
But this guy is, and I know he has a name. It's Jack?
Jack Downer.
Jack Downer, yeah. He's convinced that if he could just do this moment over again, everything would be so much better. And magically, he trades places with the photo, so that his current life sort of gets trapped in amber and becomes a photograph, while he gets to relive his life from the moment in the original photo. And it turns out that it's very different, and it's better in some ways and it's worse in others.
Right. The main character lives in this horrible shack in the outback of Australia and is completely isolated and totally depressed and a complete mess. And he relives his life where instead of dumping his college girlfriend, he stays with her and she transforms his life so that he becomes like completely obsessed with his job as a lawyer or something and works himself into an early grave at the age of 42. And I guess he has a daughter, so that's better, but he spends no time with his family, so that's kind of worse. So it's basically like he gets to completely isolate himself in a way that's more socially acceptable.
Now, a minute ago you were talking about why you could foresee that staying with Melanie wasn't going to be Jack's ticket to paradise. But the reason we know anything about their relationship is that most of the game consists of flashbacks, which is one of the reasons it's such a linear game. The game isn't gonna let you make completely different decisions because then you would be in an alternate universe and the place where the game started would no longer exist, yada, yada, yada. One of the things that I found sort of interesting was the way that in the waterfall flashback, if you do decide to just go straight to the car with Melanie and everything turns out great, I guess for varying values of great, but things do go differently, it will instead say, oh yes, wouldn't it be nice if that had been the way that things had gone? But it makes you replay the flashback the quote-unquote right way before it will let you proceed to the next trigger point. So I thought that I had a sense of the mechanics of the game, that you're sitting in your cabin, you're thinking back on your life. If you don't play it the right way, then that is ascribed to being you fantasizing about ways things could have gone. If you do think about it the right way, then it's like, okay, you are thinking about your past, and it will then let you move on to the next trigger point. But then there's the business with the tree.
Yeah, what? That was weird.
Yeah, the way that you have a flashback to when you're a little boy, and one of the things that you can do but don't have to do is plant a seedling that you find. Then later, you get into a car accident, your car ends up in a ditch, and if you did not plant the seedling in your flashback, there's no tree.
Yeah, it's really weird. You're like sitting there with a winch, and he's like, if only I had something to attach this winch to. And you're like, well, I don't know what I could do about that.
Yeah,
But you can go back in time and plant a tree there.
yes. Yes, that's the thing that made me sort of scratch my head and be like, wait, I don't think I understand the mechanics of this game because
Hike back to your cabin to trigger a flashback to go back in time and plant a tree.
exactly. You go back to your cabin and remember things differently, and then you return to your car and the tree's there. So at first I was sort of scratching my head, but then I sort of thought, well, I'll give this author credit. Maybe this is supposed to be the sign that the laws of this universe are changing, that will give him the opportunity to turn his existence in the cabin into a photograph that's frozen forever, and he can go and do his life differently. So do you think that I'm giving him too much credit by saying that that's the way that the game works and that this is a clue that the laws of physics are changing?
I thought that he was so sunk in his like misery and depression and self-centeredness that he could not perceive the tree unless he had an emotional attachment to it. So he had to remember his emotional attachment to the tree in order to even like recognize that it is a thing that he could use to get out of the ditch.
Yeah, that seems totally valid too.
But I don't know. I don't know if we're giving too much credit to the author, if it's just a weirdness that is part of it or what. I'm not sure.
Well, whatever the story with the tree is, this is a game in which you can alter the past to change the present, which is a mechanism that would seem to lend itself to a lot of interactivity. You know, you change the flashbacks in various ways and you get different results, or not if that's the way that the game views contingency. But that's not the type of interactivity that Photograph offers.
Yeah, it's a very strange game because there's certain things that it like absolutely wants you to do in a particular order and there's really nothing else to do. So you're just kind of it's like a lot of guess the verb where it's like, okay, you're going to make this decision and you are going to like go to the store now. And like no matter what else you do, it's like time to go to the store. Like you will go to the store, you will go to the store like, right now. And so you go to the store. And it's kind of like that through the whole game. It's kind of baffling. And there's all these like major character moments that are just like occur in these big text dumps where it's just like, and then you decide to like sell your like flourishing law practice and put all your money under the mattress. And it's like, that's a pretty major life decision. Like, why was I not there, like participating in that one? Why have it all just be in this big text dump? Why not just write a short story if that's what you're going to do? It felt like it was really underutilizing like its medium. And instead you have all of these like niggly little actions that don't really do anything, like going to the store, taking a shower. I don't know. I found it a very frustrating game. It's probably coming through in my voice that I did not like this game, but I did not like it. So, there you go.
But what do you think of the basic butterfly effect notion underlying this game? The idea that you can pick any moment, even an arbitrary one that you find in a random photo, and alter it slightly and end up with a completely different life.
I don't think that these like very small decisions on the order of like dumping my girlfriend today versus not dumping my girlfriend today would cause such a radical outcome shift. Unless he like became substantially more compatible with her, they would have broken up 2 months down the line anyway. It's kind of a universe in which Melanie doesn't have anything to do with it. She's clearly unhappy. She's clearly miserable with him and with their life together. And yet one word from him and she'll stay with him for the rest of his life. So I don't really buy that. You can't really expect like one decision by one person to have like such a big effect. You know, it would have to be like a change in every interaction that he has with her. He's going to have to like decide that he is going to like make this relationship work. And then she's also going to have to decide that it's worth it to her. Changing it on one day isn't sufficient.
I think that's well observed in this case, but I tend to fall on the pro-butterfly side. Like, to take two examples from my life, one's a momentous decision that was clearly momentous at the time, even if I wasn't the one making it. I was 6 when my dad finished his medical residency in Philadelphia, and he was fielding job offers. And at first, it looked like he was going to take a job in Michigan. And then at the last minute, he got another offer, and we were going to move to Georgia instead. And then at the last second, he got another offer from a group called INA in Southern California, which he ended up taking. But if things had gone even a little bit differently, I would have ended up growing up in the Rust Belt or in the South, and my life would be totally different. You know, for that matter, if he just picks a house in a different suburb, I go to a different school, I meet all different people, maybe I go to a different college, and so on and so on. But my other example is a moment that didn't even feel that momentous, which is when I randomly wandered into that Best Buy and bought the Infocom CD. You know, if I randomly go into the Barnes & Noble instead, I'd probably never discover the IF community. I hadn't previously been that interested in Infocom games and stuff. And then I don't write Photopia. I don't meet either of the girlfriends that I had from 1999 to 2013. I don't get that screenwriting job that's kept my bills paid in the 2010s. And, of course, I'm not talking to you about Photograph. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my basic makeup is such that even if I didn't end up writing a novel about growing up in Southern California, even if I didn't end up writing a new kind of interactive fiction piece, I would have written other stuff that was vaguely similar, and I would have interacted with the same kinds of people and ended up living the same basic kind of life. So I guess what I'm asking is, Claire, how do you think life works?
Well, that's a big question. I read this book recently that's all about all of the ways that the ancestry of this girl is based on all of these coincidences of these people getting together, and it results in this one person who's completely unique and unlike anything else in the world. It's like that scene in Watchmen, but 700 pages. And on the one hand, I find that, yeah, that's absolutely true. We're the summation of all of these coincidences and moments and things that couldn't have been replicated. And on the other hand, I find it kind of a totally mundane statement. Like, well, if that coincidence hadn't happened, then some other coincidence would have happened, and there would have been a different person here, and nobody would have known the difference. Nobody's mourning all of the people who don't exist because their great-great-grandparents didn't meet. That's just the way the world works. It's incredibly complex and based on a whole bunch of stuff that you can't really trace the causality of, and you do the best you can to find broad patterns, but any given moment might just be noise.
Now, I totally agree with the vast majority of that. Like, take the movie Gattaca, which is set in a world in which you and your partner can go down to the lab and select the exact sperm and the exact egg that you want so that your kid has no obvious genetic flaws. Now, obviously, there are arguments against that, such as the fact that people would probably select for traits that, in the aggregate, would harm society, but the arguments that I've heard more often are, 1, well, if we had Gattaca, you would never have been born. Which is true, because, you know, my eyes are terrible, and in the past few years my nervous system has been even worse, so I wouldn't have been picked. And argument number 2 is, well, if you support Gattaca, you're saying that my precious child should never have been born, you monster. But it seems to me that if you don't support Gattaca, you're saying that this other child, who would have been every bit as much your child, and would have been every bit as precious, should never have been born. And if you believe that there's an old man in the sky who's actively deciding that, yes, these gametes should merge, and these should not, then okay. But to say that potential child A had more right to exist than potential child B, just because potential child A, through random chance, happened to be the one who did come to exist, is malarkey, as Joe Biden would say. Where I disagree with you is when you said that we don't mourn those potential people. I agree that most people don't, or, you know, so it seems, but I definitely do. You know, in every relationship I've ever been in, my girlfriend and I have wound up choosing names for our potential children, which may not be the smartest thing because it makes them seem more real. And none of those kids were ever born, and I do totally mourn them nonstop. And so, while I didn't actually like Photograph, I could very much relate to it. I mean, sitting alone in my tiny apartment, tearing myself up over all of the terrible decisions that I've made, especially relationship wise, that's pretty much all I do these days. I am a dweller. So, how about you? Are you a dweller at all?
I am mostly not. I mean, there's like a couple of moments where I'm like, oh man, I probably shouldn't have taken that job so quickly, or things of that nature. But mostly, I don't really obsessively think about what could have been.
Would you say that's because you just don't have an obsessive temperament? Or is it because you are generally satisfied with the choices you've made?
I think probably mostly I'm largely satisfied with many of the choices that I've made. Not like every choice. Nobody has like a perfect life, but I don't really tend towards like obsessive thinking about like this broad level should have totally changed the course of my life, but like sort of small things that tend to bother me more in the moment. Like I sure embarrassed myself with that one little niggly thing. But it's hard to say, you know. I guess there have been times when I've been like unhappy and been like, man, like I wish I could do something different, and I feel like I'm trapped with the decisions I've made. I don't know if there's anybody who's like, when they're truly unhappy, don't think about what could have been different.
Yeah. I mentioned this in one of my Minutia posts recently, but Elizabeth and I were looking at this article about the happiest and unhappiest cities in Canada. They basically asked people all over Canada to rate their life satisfaction. And the 2 points that I sort of took away from it were very different from what the article said. You know, the article said, oh, people in small towns like Saguenay, Quebec are the happiest, and people in big cities like Vancouver are the unhappiest. But when I looked at the results, it was like they had a 0 to 10 scale, and Saguenay was like 8.2 and Vancouver was 7.8. So it's like there was virtually no difference.
Right.
So that was one point. But the other point was that means that people are giving their lives satisfaction scores of 8. And I find that inconceivable. Like, I can't even imagine how awesome your life would have to be going for you to give it an 8 out of 10. So that's where I think that it's something that I think was sort of the theme of Fargo, is that how happy you are seems as though it has less to do with the decisions that you make in a lot of cases than it is with how happy a person you are just as your fundamental makeup.
Yeah, it's like that study of people who like lost the use of their legs versus people who like won the lottery. In the first 3 months, people who become paraplegic are significantly more unhappy than they were before. And people who win the lottery are significantly happier. But like a year later, it's like they're basically back to baseline. If they were like pretty okay with themselves, they're like a pretty okay paraplegic. And if they were like really miserable with themselves, they're like a really miserable millionaire. And like doesn't really seem to matter that much.
Now, I have one more question for you along these lines, but it takes a little bit of setup. So, shortly after the original guest for this segment dropped out, I went to the IFDB page for this game, and I saw that Jacqueline Lott had just posted a rave review. And I thought, well, hey, if she's just played this, then maybe she might be interested in filling in. But it turned out that while she just posted her review, she'd played the game a long time back, and that it was one of her all-time favorites. And she says that the game might speak more to people her age than to a younger crowd. Now, her age is almost exactly the same as my age. She's 12 days older than I am. And we're not 55 like the guy in the story. But Jacqueline says that we are far enough along in life that we can relate to the idea of looking back ruefully. Now, you are half a generation after us. So, do you think that there's anything to the idea that Photograph left you cold because of that?
I think my problem with Photograph is not in the theme, but more in the writing and style of it. I've read a lot by Paul Auster and a lot by Kazuo Ishiguro, and both authors do a lot of remembering the past and dwelling on the past and like what could have been different about life. And I find them completely compelling and really wonderful to read. It doesn't matter that I personally feel differently, but I can empathize with their characters. And a lot of them are older characters looking back from their 70s at the way that their lives went. And I find them very interesting. Like maybe on a personal level, like I haven't felt that, but I could empathize with it. And I have empathized with it in other works.
All right, well, if the writing style is the main issue here, then I guess we should say a few words about it. What about it did not work for you?
I was just not that taken by it. I felt like it was a lot of like, well, this is how you feel, instead of it was a lot of like, show me, don't tell me, kind of was my like main point. And then like scenes that were like more fleshed out, they didn't really go anywhere. It was like, oh, you were at a flea market and then your girlfriend dumps you. And it's like, well, there wasn't very much drama to that scene. It was just sort of like, oh, well, I didn't like you anyway. Or like the main like pivotal scene at the waterfall, like Melanie she seems totally flat. She doesn't do anything or have any like interesting character. She's pretty and she is afraid of harmless herbivorous animals, and she whines a lot when she skins her knee. There weren't any characters that I like felt like were real or were interesting, and the writing style in general was a lot of like, and then this happened, and then you sold your business, and then you moved to a cabin, and then this other thing happened, and like now here you are. And it just felt like it could have used a lot of workshopping and polish.
Yeah, on the one hand, I'm glad the game isn't full of purple prose, but it does seem like it might go too far in the other direction. I mean, maybe this is supposed to convey the character's depression and flat affect, but when you examine the bag that's supposed to contain the stuff that you like to eat, it says, "It's a large paper bag full of food items." I mean, it makes it sound like it's full of like Pac-Man dots or something.
And like there were parts where he describes landscapes and like, oh, the like beautiful ferns, and it's like, well, you clearly love Australia. Like, why don't you focus on that?
Ah, yes, Australia, the land where wallabies confound you at every turn.
Yeah, I know, those wallabies. Damn them.
And with that, because I still have yet to remember to record people saying goodbye, we'll move on to our next game. And our next year, because we're moving on to 2003. Once again, the not entirely strict criteria I've established for this program are that we'll be looking at each year's Zizzy Award winners and the top 5 finishers in the fall comp. But for 2003, that list includes 2 games we won't be doing. One is The Erudition Chamber by Daniel Fries, because when I went looking online for information about it, I found a review by me. I'd totally forgotten about this, but I had actually been asked to review it for the Ministry of Peace's IF review site in 2004, so since the idea here is to catch up with games I haven't played, if you want to know what I once thought about that one, go dig up that review. The other game we won't be covering is the Zizzy Award winner for Best Writing, Narcolepsy, because I wrote it. So, on to the games we will be covering, starting with City of Secrets. City of Secrets was nominated for 7 Zizzy Awards and won the award for Best Non-Player Characters. It has kind of an interesting backstory. Emily Short was commissioned to write this game by a San Francisco goth band called Secret Secret. They were putting out a concept album and wanted to release a computer game alongside it. Now, the band is credited with the story, and I asked Emily how much they had really contributed, and she said that it was a combination of general concepts like the villain and the rebels, and a handful of more specific incidents that they said had to be included. Anyway, that album eventually fell through, and Emily got the green light to release the game on her own. And back to talk about it with me is Alex Hoffer. So, I found the beginning of City of Secrets very promising. It's set in an entirely different world, on a continent with an austere north and a more Epicurean south, sort of like Game of Thrones. You are a northerner on a train headed south to attend a wedding, and you're woken up and told that your train has broken down, but that you've been given a hotel room in the southern capital, and that you'll be upgraded to an express. So, you get out, you immediately have a brief encounter with a mysterious woman, and then you get to poke around a little bit on the way to your hotel. All in all, I thought that this was a pretty optimal combination of narrative momentum and freedom to explore. I didn't feel like I was in one of those "you are in a place" types of games, and I also didn't feel like I was on rails. I felt like I was participating in a novel, which I think is IF's sweet spot.
Interesting. If it's like being in a novel, it's probably like being in one of those novels that you have to read in English classes that I didn't take because they seemed kind of boring. I don't know, Henry James or something like that.
All right, well, you're tired enough from your journey that, you don't need to read a Henry James novel to put you to sleep. And when you wake up, you head out to explore this city. Now, cities are hard to do in IF. This one is not literally all that big. There are a couple of main streets, a couple of plazas, some alleys, there are a few spur roads, and yet it feels so big that it's kind of unwieldy to get around. What did you think of the size of this city?
Oh god, I get lost in these games all the time. And in this game, there is a compass in the lower left, but it only shows you the exits from your particular location. And I spent the entire game lost. That is how I spend any game that has a large map. That is just how I play interactive fiction.
Now, magic exists in this world, though the North has mostly rejected it. So your character is unfamiliar with it, but not shocked by it. Sort of like an American in the 1950s going to a Chinese restaurant and seeing chopsticks for the first time or something like that. One use of magic you discover is that in the city, the sun is always up. Your watch stops because it's always a little after 5 there, though typing Z does still produce the message "time passes." One of the most amusing aspects of this is that with no cycle between day and night, stores open and close at random times, which I found hilarious because that is such an IF thing. It's a standard trope that when you've done everything there is to do in a location, you get locked out of it. So in IF, stores do open and close at random times. But in City of Secrets, there's an in-story justification for it.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that I liked best about the game. I wasn't thinking about it from a playing with the trope perspective, but it felt realistic. If you ever go travel and you are in a country on a Sunday or something like that, the shops are often closing and opening for reasons that you don't understand, and it felt very realistic. And yet it also had this magical realism almost sense to it, that there is a fantasy reason why they're doing this, but at the same time it feels very real. It relates to a real experience that I have had. So I enjoyed that part immensely.
Another standard IF trope is an empty, abandoned setting, and City of Secrets makes a point of doing what it can to avoid this by putting a tag at the end of every location description to indicate that it's populated. And this is a lot less successful because it reads like code. A lady with a bad sunburn jostles you, then hurries on. An older man walks past, sipping water from a bottle. A woman in business clothes saunters past you, arm in arm with a guy with unshaven stubble. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of that output, but it's so clearly procedural that I wasn't really imagining these people so much as the switch statements that generated them.
Well, I mean, obviously that's what it's actually doing, but it felt fairly real to me. There are a lot of characters you can interact with, and one of the things that I actually realized, especially when I played the game through a second time, is that the actual number of things in the game that you actually need to do to complete the game is very, very small. The vast majority of what's going on in the game really is just setting and window dressing and backstory and all that kind of stuff, and there really is a lot of color, and you'll miss a lot of what's going on in the game if you ignore it all. But it really did feel fairly real to me. There are obviously a lot of NPCs that you can't interact with, but there is a good reason in the story for why you can't interact with them. And it did feel to me like it was a pretty good simulation of a city with a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of people who genuinely don't want to talk to you, but you can't realistically expect to have a conversation with every single background NPC.
Well, given that these days I go weeks at a time without talking to anyone, I certainly wasn't expecting that. But in any case, all of that comes later, because right after you leave the hotel for the first time, you get mugged. And I don't want to spend a long time talking about all the different bugs that we encountered in this game, but this one made me kind of sad. The game specifically presents the mugging as a puzzle, something you could avert with the right action. It says, the thief runs ahead of you to the end of the alley, then hits the gray force barrier at the end of it and turns to face you. And now, what do you do? And then a couple of turns later, when the thief is about to knock you out, now, screams the instinctive part of your brain. Now, do something now. And I thought I knew what to do. I had a weapon, a pair of scissors that I'd found in the hotel bathroom. So I tried stab thief, and it said, you are, as always, unarmed. And I thought, no, I'm not. But I went back, and I tried cut thief with scissors. And the game said, that might be construed as an attack. Well, right, that's the idea.
Yeah, one thing I thought was sort of interesting about this game is that my experience with it ended up swinging back and forth a lot between, wow, there is an incredible depth of implementation here, and wow, I can't believe how buggy this is. For example, at the end, when you're trying to get arrested, when I tried to break the robot in the sweet serving cafe in order to get arrested, it says you don't want to break the robot because it reminds you of home. And I was like, wow, like that's a lot of depth. But at the same time, when I tried to attack one of the people who had been brain sucked in order to try to get arrested, he gave me this default response, which was clearly designed for someone who hadn't been brain sucked about, like, young sir, like, I wouldn't do that if I were you. He was acting like a totally normal person in like the second that I attacked him. So there were lots of things like that where in many ways the game is very deep and very well implemented, but it also seemed kind of buggy.
Yeah, I noted down some of the bugs I encountered, but it's not really worth going into them in detail. As general categories, there were some things that weren't implemented, like the custom response to defending yourself with the scissors. Sometimes the game lost track of what I knew and gave me weird dialogue options. And sometimes I hit parsing and printing glitches. There'd be random nouns jammed together with no spaces, stuff like that. Actually, in the segment about savoir-faire that Claire Parker and I did in Radio K #1, I noted the same thing. And since I wasn't doing anything weird when I encountered those savoir-faire bugs, I wondered why the beta testers hadn't caught a lot of them. And that was the one thing in that segment that Emily took exception to. She said that criticizing the bugs was fair game, but that the testers were great and not to be impugned.
Yeah, as a professional software tester, this is something that I think a lot. When you see a game that's full of bugs and you're wondering, how is this possible? It's almost never the tester's fault. It's always because of production schedules. Probably 90% of those bugs that they're shipping with, they knew about when they shipped with. Yeah, so I tend to agree with Emily on that one.
So after you get mugged, you're picked up by the bad guy, Malik, who's running the city and who's turned it into a dictatorial surveillance state. And he asks you to go look for Yvain, the mysterious underground leader you ran into at the beginning of the game. His idea is that since you're obviously a tourist, no one will think you're a member of the secret police, and people will open up to you. Now, you can go ahead and pretend to join up with Malik, or you can stand your ground and refuse to do so, but either way, you then move into the main portion of the game, and the basic mechanic becomes pretty clear. Emily was known for these conversation games, and now, instead of just one conversational partner, you have a whole city full of people to talk to. And you can talk to most of them. The problem is that it's almost always the same conversation. Have you seen Yvain? What do you think about Yvain? And so forth.
You do have the same conversation a lot. I guess it's kind of an icebreaker to give you something to talk about. Yes, it is a bit silly. I was somewhat surprised that the NPCs were willing to give up their political beliefs so easily, and they were all pretty transparent about what they believed. I guess otherwise it would be really hard to get help from them, but it seemed a little bit inconsistent with the setting that people would admit to not being fans of Malik to this random foreigner that they had never met. So you do get a little bit of diversity of opinion. when you talk to people. It's not exactly the same conversation every time because people have different political beliefs, but yeah, it is super tedious. You can also talk to them about a lot of different things. It took me a while to figure out the conversation system and to figure out that you could actually do that. But once I did that, I started enjoying the game a bit more.
Now, as I've talked about before on this show, Emily made her name in IF with a conversation game called Galatea. And that game was very impressive on a formal level because of the depth of conversation and the unprecedented level of emotional modeling and the way that it would track how frequently you were switching topics. It was just a huge leap forward in conversational systems. But what really made Galatea work was the content of that conversation. You were talking with this amazing animate statue with quartz crystals sparkling in her skin, and you could ask her questions like, how did it feel to have your eyes drilled in? And the content of the conversations in City of Secrets is just not as cool. Another issue I had with these conversations, which was actually kind of an issue in Galatea too, is that there's one person who takes part in all of the conversations, and that's the player character. And as you just alluded to, City of Secrets uses a hybrid conversational system where you can ask anything you want, but you're also presented with a menu of options to choose from if you'd rather do that. And this is something I've talked about before in relation to my own game Narcolepsy, and also in relation to my favorite game, Star Control 2, which is that even though one of the things about an interactive medium is that you get to shape what your character is like to a certain extent by choosing that character's actions, conversational menus are a little bit different, because, to me at least, it feels as though the options that you see represent the things that your character is thinking of to say. So, in games in which the list of options is full of crude insults, even if you never pick any of them, your character is still a jerk. And in City of Secrets, a lot of your dialogue options are sarcasm without the cleverness that makes sarcasm funny. Like, there's a part where you can ring a bell, but if you do that, people yell at you, and your sidekick says, "I think that was kind of a faux pas." And one of your potential replies is, "Really? I never would have guessed." And it seems to me that your character could be likable for being nice, or he could be likable for being funny, but if he's just going to be blandly snide all the time, that's not a pleasant person to spend a lot of time with.
Interesting. I kind of had the opposite reaction, especially the second time I played through when it became clear that so many of the characters were fucking with me. Like, they were acting nice, but they were actually manipulating me and, trying to brain suck me or kill me or whatever. That I actually really appreciated the option to be a sort of passive-aggressive jerk right back to them. So I very much enjoyed the fact that I could choose insulting conversation topics when I was talking to characters who are actually kind of evil, even though they act pleasant, like the concierge, like Malik, like the priest at the temple. I actually, on my second playthrough, I managed to annoy the priest so much that he left the temple in a huff. So this actually did not bother me because it felt appropriate that your character can react in a hostile way when everyone is being hostile to him.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Again, it's not that I minded the hostility in and of itself, I just wish that it had been more clever. Like, to pick an example kind of at random, I remember that there was an episode of Frasier in which Frasier tells Daphne that someone named Clive had left a message for her. And Daphne says, "Clive? Did he sound British?" And the player character in City of Secrets would probably say something like, "Yes, people named Clive do, in fact, tend to be from Britain." Whereas the reply on the show is, "No, he was one of those fiery Mexican Clives," which makes the same point in a much funnier way. And if the dialogue options were like that, then hey, be as sarcastic as you want. But I'm glad you mentioned the priest, because that brings me to actually the main thing I wanted to talk about. The big conflict in the game is between two schools of thought, represented by, on the one hand, the illuminated ones, who are affiliated with Malik and the government, and on the other side, the Gnostics, who are affiliated with Yvain and the underground. And the game is very clear about which side is correct.
When I started the game, I was convinced when I had my first meeting with Malik that this was a game in which I was actually going to be able to choose which side I was going to be on, that Malik would try to recruit me to his side, and then Yvain would try to recruit me to her side, and there would be 2 or 3 endings, one where I chose Yvain, one where I chose Malik, and then maybe there would be like an unaffiliated ending. Maybe I'm just too influenced by a lot of modern games that do that kind of thing, but I was actually quite surprised when it turns out that no, Malik is just evil. You cannot choose to side with him. You have to side with Yvain. I thought that it was going to be some kind of setup that's sort of mirroring a modern political debate that we have right now between freedom and security. That seemed to be the choice that you were going to be given, with Malik on the side of the Patriot Act and security cameras everywhere, but there's no crime except for the part where you personally get mugged, but I guess that was set up. And with Yvain being the side that I think that it was assumed that the player would prefer, which is not trying to excessively control things and allowing personal freedom, but also allowing more danger. But yeah, that was not actually the setup at all that the game really had.
Yeah, I honestly don't know whether the secret guys were responding to the big events of the time with, as you say, the imposition of the Patriot Act and the Total Information Awareness Program with that creepy eye logo. It does seem to me like the struggle here is framed as more abstract and philosophical, though. The Gnostics are all about the virtue of balance, the necessity of both yin and yang, whereas the illuminated ones say, no, yang is best. Let's have nothing but yang. And of course, the big emblematic example of this is that in the city, Malik uses his power to keep the sun from setting, so it's daylight all the time, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, coming from a goth band, is presented as dystopian and oppressive.
Like, it really does not try to make the argument that the illuminated ones have a point. It's just like Malik is straight up evil. He is so evil that he, in fact, sold his soul to the devil in order to get his magical powers, which really felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. But no, the game has a very clear opinion about which side is right.
Yeah, and my take on that opinion is that, on the one hand, it's kind of a dull theme, because to the extent that it's just saying, extremism bad, balance good, that's the sort of thing that nobody really disagrees with. But on the other hand, I actually do disagree with it. As I've talked about in a lot of my calendar articles, I think that in most public controversies, it's the radicals who tend to end up on the right side of history. The question is just which group of radicals will turn out to be right. Moderates are pretty much guaranteed to be wrong, because when you try to strike a balance between something that is correct and something that is incorrect, you're always going to end up with something that's partially incorrect. The example that springs to my mind is that the United States spent the bulk of the 19th century trying to strike a balance between free states and slave states. You had the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska, popular sovereignty, on. And it makes me want to ask, if it's bad for the city to have daylight all the time, does that mean that it's bad for every state to be a free state? I kind of like the fact that we have all free states and no slave states. I'm not a big fan of the yin and yang where that sort of thing is concerned. Or, to pick a more innocuous example, I often hear people from the Northeast who move to California complain about the lack of seasons here, which is the same sort of thing on a macro scale. You know, like how in the city, the rebels want a cycle between day and night and day and night. These people want a cycle of a time of year when it's hot and sticky, and one when it's cool and damp with colorful leaves, and then one when it's frigid and snowy, and one when it's cool and damp with colorful blossoms. And I know that mainstream opinion says that that's what you're supposed to believe about seasons, but personally, I grew up without seasons, and when I moved to places that had them, I hated them. I actually do prefer that it just be nice, always, which is why I moved back here. So, you're somebody who grew up in the Northeast and moved to California. What do you think about seasons? Or the lack thereof?
Personally, in terms of the season thing, I feel both ways. I very much miss the fact that there are no thunderstorms here. Even having extreme weather like blizzards can be kind of cool. springtime in New England is gorgeous and wonderful, but all I really want is just little snippets of some of the most extreme parts of the season. Like if we could get like one blizzard and a handful of thunderstorms, and then other than that, the weather would be perfectly nice. That would be perfect. The extreme weather is quite fun, but the day-to-day experience of extreme weather is a huge drag. That's how I feel about seasons.
All right, well, we're coming to the end of our time, so to wrap things up, I understand you had some issues with the cutscene at the end.
Actually, one thing that struck me when I played the game through a second time is, wow, there are actually a lot of cutscenes. It doesn't feel that way when you play it the first time, because when you play it the first time, the cutscenes are interspersed with a lot of wandering around, talking to people, figuring out what to do. But when you skip everything that's not completely essential, the game consists pretty much entirely of cutscenes. But yeah, the ending cutscene was very WTF for me. I felt that the element of Malik selling his soul to the demon in particular was like really out of left field, like totally out of left field. And I didn't feel like I had a ton of agency in the ending because everything that I was supposed to do was so clearly messaged to me, like the exact verbs that I was supposed to type. This was actually one of my disappointments with the game, is that it doesn't have a ton of puzzles. It also has a novice mode, which is kind of surprising because, again, there are just so few puzzles to begin with. And the puzzles that it does have are honestly not perhaps the world's greatest puzzles, at least some of them, such as getting the pass. It is cool that many of them have alternative solutions. It seems like almost every puzzle has at least two ways of solving it, which is cool, but at the same time, it's also kind of confusing. There just aren't many puzzles. They often aren't very challenging. Oftentimes, I was just sort of wandering around, not having any idea where to get started on solving the puzzle. But then when you do get the thread, it becomes super obvious. Related to that, one thing that I never really understood about the game is that there are a lot of things happening that seem totally irrelevant to the plot. So I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of window dressing, that you can actually just do a straight line to the end of the game and miss a huge amount of what's going on. And I actually felt that this was kind of to the game's detriment. There are locations and characters that I still don't know why they're there. For example, the backstage of the old Vic. So there's apparently a password there that you can use to get into the university, but you don't actually need the password because foreigners don't need the password to get into the university. And I still do not understand like what the point of that whole puzzle is, since you don't actually need to solve it. And there are a number of other things where there was detail that I did not understand why it was there.
Well, I'm totally cool with throwing things into games for no reason other than just so that the game have more cool stuff in it. Actually, the last thing I wanted to talk about was one of these little Easter eggs. In City of Secrets, you can happen across a book called The Meditations of Queen Rhine. So, first, did you get to that part? Like, did you find the Meditations of Queen Rhine and did you read them?
I think I read them. I have to say that that kind of content generally slides right off me. I don't usually pay a whole lot of attention to description, to philosophical discourses, to poetry or art within games. So I'm pretty sure that I found it and I read it, and I could not remember what it was 5 seconds after I read it.
Well, it was very striking to me because, to me at least, it's so clearly a very, very thinly veiled author's statement.
Oh, yeah, this is the one about, like, don't listen to the haters and stuff? Yeah.
Right. And I was surprised to find a statement that was so on the nose coming from someone who's so private that she even keeps her real name hidden from the public. So, a little bit of setup here. In the period leading up to the release of City of Secrets from the year 2000 to 2003, Emily released a ton of work that got a lot of acclaim. Galatea, first of all, and then Metamorphoses and Savoir-Faire, and, I looked this up, 11 other games of varying sizes and degrees of seriousness just in that 3-year period. So we're talking like 5 games a year. And, like I said, she got a lot of acclaim for them. She immediately shot into the top rank of IF authors in terms of popularity and respect. But in addition to all that acclaim, she also wound up as the #1 target of the interactive fiction newsgroup trolls. And even a lot of the positive attention she got was not the kind that you would want. You know, there was a lot of courtship from guys on the newsgroup. And when I say courtship, I mean like calling her milady and stuff like that. And these guys persisted with it even after being told to stop. And on top of all that, Emily answered all of the programming questions that people posted, and she got rewarded for that by basically being treated like a public utility. Like people would complain, "Hey, you're not answering my questions fast enough. What kind of tech support are you?" And to those of us who knew her, this was actually really worrisome because it was really obvious the kind of toll it was taking on her. And not just all of this community stuff that I've been talking about, but just the way that she would work on IF projects for like a week straight and forget to sleep and eat. And then here are the Meditations of Queen Rhine, which are talking about that exact thing. There's a big part about when you are working on your project and you forget to sleep or eat, and talking about how the artist is driven by, here's the quote, "a cursed compulsion laid on her from the outside," and how the actual work is an exercise in, quote, "suffering and endurance," and how, quote, "her reward is abuse and jealousy," and about how people call the work trivial because she's put in a year of agony in order to create a program in a dead medium that's going to be played by like 50 people, and how ultimately, quote, "the passion itself, which gives us both our power and our pain, is the mark of eternity in our souls." And I wondered how all of this read to someone who didn't have all of that background to connect it up to.
Yes, now that you describe it, I remember it. It was pretty clearly an author's statement. I didn't know anything about the particular circumstances of, Emily's having to deal with internet hatred or whatever. It just struck me as sort of a generic, like, haters gonna hate, don't worry about it, you're driven by art. Maybe slightly self-indulgent, but, it's not an important part of the game. It's sort of almost like a little Easter egg.
Yeah. My reaction was that I cannot really relate. And the thing is, I actually do have obsessive-compulsive disorder, so I do understand compulsions, but unfortunately for me, mine are not about getting work done. Mine are about, like, heading to the airport and having to turn back and go home to check whether the door is locked again, or going to Trader Joe's and having to feel every Ritter Sport through the package in order to find out which one has the most symmetrical arrangement of hazelnuts. So if I were compelled to actually get work done, that might actually come in handy.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Does anyone have that?
Well, that's apparently how Emily turned out 5 games a year. And meanwhile, it's an open question whether I'll even be able to get 5 of these shows out this year. But that wraps it up for show number 3. Thanks to my guests, Claire Parker and Alex Hoffer, and to the authors of the games we talked about, Steve Evans and Emily Short. And thank you for listening. We'll be continuing to work our way through the mid-2000s in the months to come, so if you're familiar with interactive fiction as a medium but haven't played all these games, and you think you might like to be on the show, let me know. Just go to adamcodry.ac and click on the stamp. And even though I never remember to record anybody else saying goodbye, at least I can record myself saying it. So, goodbye.